he thought the quiet woman seated against the far glass wall was nothing more than a temporary note-taker, another forgettable employee in a room reserved for people who moved money like chess pieces. But Jonathan Reed had no idea that within the next hour, the most important deal of his career would slip from his hands and land squarely in hers. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe dignity always finds its way back, hit like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us never to judge too quickly. Now, back to Claire Bennett. The 38th floor of the Meridian Crown Hotel overlooked all of downtown Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the pale morning sun across polished marble and chrome. Inside the executive conference suite, every chair was filled with men in tailored suits worth more than most people's monthly rent. Leather portfolios. Platinum watches. Quiet voices discussing numbers large enough to change industries. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Reed, founder of Reed Capital Holdings, a billionaire known on Wall Street for two things: closing impossible deals and having very little patience for anyone he considered unnecessary. His charcoal suit was flawless, his silver cufflinks catching the light each time he gestured toward the digital presentation glowing behind him. Today's meeting mattered. A consortium of Arab investors had flown in from Dubai overnight to finalize a $200 million hospitality acquisition. If Jonathan secured their backing before noon, his company would dominate 3 luxury properties across the East Coast. If he failed, months of strategy would collapse in front of competitors waiting like wolves. Jonathan hated uncertainty, and this morning, uncertainty walked into the room wearing a plain grey cardigan. Claire Bennett entered quietly with a slim binder pressed to her chest, her low heels barely making a sound on the marble floor. Her blonde hair was tied into a simple knot. No jewelry except a small silver watch. No designer handbag. No polished executive confidence. She looked more like someone from the accounting basement than a woman who belonged near billionaires and foreign dignitaries. Jonathan glanced up once, and the annoyance on his face was instant. "Where is Melissa?" he asked sharply to his operations director. "Melissa called in sick, sir." HR sent Ms. Bennett from administrative support to take notes. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Administrative support. On the biggest morning of the quarter. Claire stepped toward the end of the conference table and offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Mr. Reed." He barely looked at her. "Just sit right, and do not interrupt." The sentence was cold enough to make 2 junior analysts lower their eyes. Claire simply nodded and took the smallest chair near the wall, placing her binder on her lap as if she had already accepted invisibility. Around the room, the Arab delegation exchanged measured glances. Their leader, Sheikh Omar Al Nasir, sat in an immaculate navy robe beneath a tailored overcoat, his dark eyes observant, unreadable. Beside him were 3 senior financial advisors and an interpreter hired by Jonathan's team only 12 hours earlier. Everyone settled. Coffee cups steamed. Tablets lit up. Pens clicked. Jonathan moved to the head of the table with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding every breath in the room. "Gentlemen," he began, smiling with calculated charm, "by this afternoon, we'll all be celebrating one of the most profitable partnerships in modern hospitality." Several people nodded. Claire lowered her eyes and opened her binder. To Jonathan Reed, she was furniture. To everyone else, she was a shadow in grey. But shadows, when ignored long enough, sometimes become the only thing left standing when the light shifts. Jonathan Reed launched into the presentation with the smooth precision that had made him famous in financial magazines and feared in boardrooms from Boston to Los Angeles. Every slide behind him displayed projected revenue, occupancy growth, brand expansion, and return percentages that looked irresistible to anyone interested in multiplying wealth. His voice remained calm, measured, almost theatrical. He knew how to make numbers sound like destiny. Across from him, Sheikh Omar Al Nasir listened without expression, one hand resting lightly on a black fountain pen while his advisors scanned the printed contracts. The hired interpreter translated Jonathan's statement sentence by sentence into Arabic, though there was a slight stiffness in his pronunciation that made Claire lift her eyes for the briefest moment. She noticed it immediately, but said nothing. Jonathan continued speaking as though the room already belonged to him. Our analysts project a 14% increase in valuation within 18 months, he said confidently. This is not simply an investment. This is market ownership. One of the Arab advisors murmured something quietly to the sheikh. Another flipped back 3 pages in the contract packet. Jonathan saw the movement and pressed harder, smiling as if reassurance alone could close signatures. Reed Capital has never failed a hospitality partner. The operations director beside him nodded too eagerly. Claire kept writing, her pen moving in neat deliberate lines. She noted not only the numbers, but the pauses, the exchanged looks, the tiny shifts of mood Jonathan was too busy performing to notice. Then came the first fracture. Jonathan clicked to a slide detailing ownership structure and long-term governance rights. The interpreter translated. Halfway through the sentence, Sheikh Omar's eyebrows lowered. He turned sharply toward his advisors and spoke in rapid Arabic, his tone no longer neutral. The other 3 men immediately joined in, their voices low but intense, pages rustling, fingers tapping at a clause in the printed agreement. Jonathan stopped mid-gesture. For 1 second he looked mildly inconvenienced. By the 3rd second, his smile had begun to thin. "Is there a concern?" he asked. The interpreter swallowed. "They are discussing clarification." Jonathan exhaled through his nose. "Then clarify." The interpreter listened again, but his face had already gone pale. He translated awkwardly, stumbling over terminology. "They believe, perhaps, your company is requesting controlling authority beyond agreed partnership expectations." Jonathan blinked. "That is incorrect." He stepped toward the contracts. No, they are misunderstanding Section 9. But the misunderstanding was spreading across the polished table like spilled ink. Sheikh Omar spoke again, this time firmer. One advisor closed his folder. Another removed his glasses with visible disappointment. Jonathan looked to the interpreter. "Tell them they retain strategic equity participation." The interpreter attempted to relay the message, but whatever came out only deepened the tension. Claire could see it in the sheikh's face. This was no longer a technical pause. This was offense. Jonathan's chief counsel leaned over and whispered, "We may have a language nuance problem." Jonathan shot him an irritated glance. "Then fix it." Yet no one moved. No one in Jonathan Reed's expensive army seemed able to bridge the widening silence. Claire looked down at the Arabic notation printed beside one of the translated clauses and felt a small knot form in her stomach. The wording was wrong. Not disastrously wrong to an American reader, but deeply insulting in a Gulf business context. It implied supervision where there should have been mutual stewardship. It sounded less like partnership and more like distrust dressed in legal language. Jonathan did not know that. The interpreter clearly did not know that. But Claire knew. She lifted her head slightly, watching the Arab delegation retreat behind expressions of polished courtesy, the most dangerous kind. Deals did not explode in rooms like this. They froze. And once frozen, they almost never thawed. Jonathan Reed felt the room slipping, and men like Jonathan Reed did not tolerate slippage. His fingers tightened around the remote in his hand as he forced another smile that no longer looked natural under the white conference lights. "Gentlemen," he said, leaning forward with practiced confidence, "I believe there is a translation issue, nothing more." The interpreter repeated something hesitant in Arabic, but Sheikh Omar did not even look at him this time. Instead, the older billionaire slowly closed the contract folder in front of him, a small movement that landed heavier than any shouted objection. One advisor whispered to another. A third checked his watch. The temperature in the suite seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonathan recognized the signs. Interest was being replaced by polite withdrawal. In billion-dollar negotiations, polite withdrawal was simply a more expensive form of rejection. He turned sharply toward his legal counsel. "Explain Section 9 in plain language." The attorney cleared his throat and launched into a stream of legal reassurance, but every sentence sounded increasingly defensive. Ownership rights. Supervisory protections. Operational assurances. Safeguard provisions. The more they explained, the more suspicious the Arab delegation appeared. Jonathan could see it now in Sheikh Omar's eyes. Not confusion. Offense. That realization sent a thin blade of panic under Jonathan's ribs. He had spent 6 months arranging this meeting, 3 private dinners, 2 charter flights, and nearly $500,000 in consultant fees to get these men into this room. If they walked away, the financial press would smell weakness by Monday morning. Competitors would circle. Investors would question his judgment. Failure had a scent, and Jonathan could already smell it. Across the table, Claire Bennett looked down at the disputed paragraph again. The Arabic annotation in the margin was not just stiff. It was culturally tone-deaf. The chosen phrase implied that Reed Capital would reserve the right to observe and intervene if trust standards were not met. To American executives, it sounded cautious. To men whose business traditions were built on honor and faith, it sounded like an accusation written before the partnership had even begun. Claire inhaled quietly. She knew exactly why Sheikh Omar's jaw had hardened. She also knew every second of silence was making recovery harder. She lifted her chin slightly. "Mr. Reed," she said softly. It was the first time her voice had entered the room since the meeting began. Jonathan did not even turn fully toward her. "Not now." Claire held her binder a little tighter. The advisors resumed murmuring in Arabic, faster this time. One of them pushed his chair back an inch, the universal signal of a man mentally preparing to leave. Claire tried again, still calm. "Mr. Reed, I think the wording," Jonathan spun this time, his patience finally cracking under humiliation and fear. "Ms. Bennett," he said, each syllable clipped enough to cut glass, "this level of business is beyond administrative duties." The sentence hung in the air. 2 junior analysts stared at the table. Jonathan's operations director pretended to shuffle papers. Even the interpreter looked embarrassed for her. Claire went still. Her cheeks warmed, but her expression did not change. Jonathan turned away as if dismissing office furniture. "Please continue taking notes." The room became painfully quiet. There it was, the public reduction, neat and polished, delivered in front of billionaires and executives alike. Jonathan had not shouted. He had not insulted her with crude words. He had done something colder. He had reminded everyone exactly where he believed she belonged. Claire lowered her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she looked directly at Sheikh Omar al-Nasir. Something steady passed across her face, not anger, not wounded pride, but decision. And when she opened her mouth again, Jonathan Reed was still facing the screen, unaware that the next sound he was about to hear would change the balance of power in that room forever. Jonathan Reed felt the room slipping, and men like Jonathan Reed did not tolerate slippage. His fingers tightened around the remote in his hand as he forced another smile that no longer looked natural under the white conference lights. "Gentlemen," he said, leaning forward with practiced confidence, "I believe there is a translation issue, nothing more." The interpreter repeated something hesitant in Arabic, but Sheikh Omar did not even look at him this time. Instead, the older billionaire slowly closed the contract folder in front of him, a small movement that landed heavier than any shouted objection. One advisor whispered to another. A third checked his watch. The temperature in the suite seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jonathan recognized the signs. Interest was being replaced by polite withdrawal. In billion-dollar negotiations, polite withdrawal was simply a more expensive form of rejection. He turned sharply toward his legal counsel. "Explain Section 9 in plain language." The attorney cleared his throat and launched into a stream of legal reassurance, but every sentence sounded increasingly defensive. Ownership rights. Supervisory protections. Operational assurances. Safeguard provisions. The more they explained, the more suspicious the Arab delegation appeared. Jonathan could see it now in Sheikh Omar's eyes. Not confusion. Offense. That realization sent a thin blade of panic under Jonathan's ribs. He had spent 6 months arranging this meeting, 3 private dinners, 2 charter flights, and nearly $500,000 in consultant fees to get these men into this room. If they walked away, the financial press would smell weakness by Monday morning. Competitors would circle. Investors would question his judgment. Failure had a scent, and Jonathan could already smell it. Across the table, Claire Bennett looked down at the disputed paragraph again. The Arabic annotation in the margin was not just stiff. It was culturally tone-deaf. The chosen phrase implied that Reed Capital would reserve the right to observe and intervene if trust standards were not met. To American executives, it sounded cautious. To men whose business traditions were built on honor and face, it sounded like an accusation written before the partnership had even begun. Claire inhaled quietly. She knew exactly why Sheikh Omar's jaw had hardened. She also knew every second of silence was making recovery harder. She lifted her chin slightly. "Mr. Reed," she said softly. It was the first time her voice had entered the room since the meeting began. Jonathan did not even turn fully toward her. "Not now." Claire held her binder a little tighter. The advisors resumed murmuring in Arabic, faster this time. One of them pushed his chair back an inch, the universal signal of a man mentally preparing to leave. Claire tried again, still calm. "Mr. Reed, I think the wording," Jonathan spun this time, his patience finally cracking under humiliation and fear. "Ms. Bennett," he said, each syllable clipped enough to cut glass, "this level of business is beyond administrative duties." The sentence hung in the air. 2 junior analysts stared at the table. Jonathan's operations director pretended to shuffle papers. Even the interpreter looked embarrassed for her. Claire went still. Her cheeks warmed, but her expression did not change. Jonathan turned away as if dismissing office furniture. "Please continue taking notes." The room became painfully quiet. There it was, the public reduction, neat and polished, delivered in front of billionaires and executives alike. Jonathan had not shouted. He had not insulted her with crude words. He had done something colder. He had reminded everyone exactly where he believed she belonged. Claire lowered her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she looked directly at Sheikh Omar al-Nasir. Something steady passed across her face, not anger, not wounded pride, but decision. And when she opened her mouth again, Jonathan Reed was still facing the screen, unaware that the next sound he was about to hear would change the balance of power in that room forever. Jonathan Reed opened his mouth, but no polished executive recovery came out. The silence after Sheikh Omar's comment was too complete, too exposing. A moment earlier Jonathan had been the unquestioned authority at the head of the table. Now he looked like a man who had misplaced control in front of everyone who mattered. Claire Bennett lowered her eyes modestly as if she had done nothing extraordinary, yet the center of gravity in the conference suite had already shifted toward her. Sheikh Omar folded his hands and spoke again, this time directing every word to Claire rather than the billionaire who had organized the meeting. He asked whether the revised stewardship language she suggested would still preserve investor visibility into operational standards across the 3 East Coast properties. Claire answered carefully, explaining that a dual oversight board with rotating review privileges would communicate partnership instead of suspicion while protecting financial transparency on both sides. She even referenced a nearly identical structure used in 2 successful luxury acquisitions in Dubai 5 years earlier. One of the Arab advisors smiled openly now. Another made notes with renewed interest. Jonathan's legal team looked as if they had been dropped into someone else's meeting. The hired interpreter sat motionless, his role dissolved. Jonathan tried to step back in. "Yes, of course, that aligns with our," but Sheikh Omar raised one gentle hand without even looking at him, signaling that he wished Claire to continue. It was not rude. It was worse. It was instinctive dismissal. Jonathan stopped speaking mid-sentence. The room felt suddenly smaller around him. Claire remained composed, never triumphant, never theatrical. She clarified cultural phrasing around long-term trust, suggested revisions to the ownership appendix, and translated 2 subtle concerns that had not even been voiced aloud in English because Jonathan's team had failed to read the delegation's body language. Every answer landed with quiet precision. No wasted words. No showing off. Just competence so undeniable it made Jonathan's earlier condescension look almost absurd. 20 minutes passed like this. 20 minutes in which Reed Capital's billionaire founder became a spectator to his own negotiation while the woman he had assigned to note-taking rebuilt the entire partnership line by line. Finally, Sheikh Omar closed his folder once more, but this time with satisfaction instead of offense. He turned to his advisors. A brief exchange in Arabic followed, calm and measured. Then he looked back at Claire. "Your understanding honors both business and respect," he said. "That is rare." Claire gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." Jonathan felt every syllable like sand in his throat. He had spent years cultivating an image of infallibility, years ensuring every boardroom entered already half convinced of his superiority. Yet all it had taken to fracture that image was one woman in a plain cardigan whom he had considered beneath interruption. His operations director avoided eye contact. The junior analysts were pretending to focus on documents they were no longer reading. Even Jonathan's own counsel seemed more interested in Claire than in him. Then came the sentence that landed hardest of all. Sheikh Omar turned to Jonathan for the first time in nearly half an hour and said, with courteous calm, "Mr. Reed, I must admit, had Ms. Bennett not been present, this meeting would have ended very differently." There was no accusation in his tone, which somehow made it sharper. Jonathan forced a stiff smile that convinced no one. "Yes," he said quietly, "I can see that." But seeing it and surviving it were 2 different things. Because Jonathan Reed was beginning to understand that this was no longer merely a saved deal. It was a public reordering of value, and every person in that gleaming room had just witnessed who truly deserved to be listened to. The contracts were reopened, revised notes were added, and pens began moving again across expensive paper, but Jonathan Reed no longer felt like the architect of the morning. He felt like a guest watching someone else quietly rescue the structure he had nearly allowed to collapse. Claire Bennett sat exactly where she had sat from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, binder open, speaking only when addressed, yet every time Sheikh Omar had a question, his eyes found her first. It happened once, then twice, then so consistently that nobody in the room could pretend not to notice. Jonathan's name was on the company logo displayed behind the screen, but Claire had become the voice carrying its credibility. A revised partnership clause was drafted within 15 minutes. Shared governance language replaced supervisory language. Cultural trust references were inserted into the memorandum. Claire translated each nuance in both directions, ensuring no phrase carried hidden insult, no legal safeguard sounded like concealed arrogance. The Arab advisors, who earlier had looked ready to walk out, now leaned forward with genuine engagement. One even laughed softly at a small linguistic misunderstanding Claire explained involving the American use of the word control in investment circles. The ice was gone. In its place stood something Jonathan had not earned but was benefiting from anyway, restored confidence. He hated that realization. More than once he tried to reclaim momentum. As I was saying regarding projected earnings, he would begin, only for a follow-up question to be directed to Claire concerning wording, intent, or relationship. Framing. Each interruption was polite. Each one carved another quiet notch into his pride. Jonathan had built an empire by being the smartest voice in every room. Men deferred to him. Lawyers waited for his nod. Analysts memorized his preferences before meetings. Yet now he found himself checking Claire's expression before speaking, as though some part of him had already accepted that she understood the room better than he did. That was the humiliation no tailored suit could hide. At last, after nearly 40 additional minutes of negotiation, Sheikh Omar lifted his pen and signed the preliminary commitment sheet. One by one, the advisors followed. Jonathan's team released a collective breath. A deal worth $200 million had been saved from the edge of polite disaster. Jonathan stepped forward automatically, ready to deliver his standard closing gratitude, but Sheikh Omar stood first and extended his hand past him. Not to Jonathan. To Claire. The movement was graceful and devastating. Claire rose, clearly surprised, and shook his hand respectfully. Ms. Bennett, Sheikh Omar said, today you protected not only a transaction, but mutual dignity. In our world, that matters more. Claire gave a small sincere smile. I am glad I could help. Jonathan remained standing half a step away, his own prepared handshake suspended in emptiness for an awkward heartbeat before he slowly lowered it. Nobody commented. Nobody needed to. The image had already branded itself into every witness in that room. Billionaire founder sidelined. Quiet administrative woman honored. Even Jonathan's legal counsel looked down to hide the discomfort on his face. Then came one final twist of the knife. Sheikh Omar glanced toward Jonathan and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than malice, how long has Ms. Bennett been leading your international communications? Jonathan blinked. She has not, he answered, his voice sounding thinner than usual. Sheikh Omar's brows lifted. Interesting. He said nothing else, but the single word floated through the suite heavier than accusation. Interesting. As if to say, how could a man responsible for billions fail to recognize the most valuable person in his own room? Jonathan turned toward Claire then, really turned toward her, and for the first time all morning he was not seeing a cardigan, a support employee, or an inconvenient substitute. He was seeing a mystery he had been arrogant enough to dismiss. And Jonathan Reed had just begun to realize that the answer to who Claire Bennett truly was might embarrass him even more than what had already happened. People began gathering documents, chairs shifted softly across marble, and the formal smiles of successful negotiation returned to the conference suite, but Jonathan Reed remained rooted for a moment longer than everyone else. He watched Claire Bennett slide her binder closed as if she had merely completed routine clerical work. No self-congratulation. No dramatic relief. No attempt to capitalize on the admiration now orbiting around her. That quietness unsettled him more than any boast would have. Most people who saved a billionaire from public embarrassment would savor the moment. Claire seemed eager to disappear back into the wallpaper. Jonathan was not used to mysteries he could not instantly categorize. As the Arab delegation exited with his legal counsel and operations team escorting them toward the private lunchroom, Jonathan finally spoke. Ms. Bennett, he called. Claire turned. Yes, Mr. Reed. Her tone was the same respectful softness she had used all morning, as if his earlier dismissals had not happened. Somehow that made them sting more. Jonathan gestured toward the now nearly empty conference table. Stay a moment. She nodded and remained standing beside her chair. For the first time since the meeting began, they were alone except for the distant clink of glasses being arranged outside the suite doors. Sunlight reflected off the windows behind them, throwing pale strips across the polished floor. Jonathan loosened his cufflink slightly, a rare tell of discomfort. How, he asked, does an administrative support employee speak Gulf Arabic at that level? Claire looked at him steadily. There was no triumph in her face, only a kind of patient neutrality. I lived in Dubai for 11 years, she answered. Jonathan frowned. Doing what? International hospitality mediation, she said. The words landed with such plain simplicity that Jonathan almost missed their weight. He stared. Mediation. Claire nodded. My former firm specialized in cross-cultural negotiations between American developers and Middle Eastern investment groups. Most of the work involved exactly what happened today. Legal language often says one thing. Business pride hears another. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. Former firm. Claire answered, Bennett and Rowe Global Advisory. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as recognition flickered. He knew that name. Every major East Coast investor knew that name. Bennett and Rowe had consulted on several billion-dollar resort acquisitions before abruptly dissolving 4 years ago. Their cultural risk assessments were considered among the best in the industry. Jonathan looked at Claire again, this time almost searching for signs that she was joking. She was not. "You were with Bennett and Rowe?" he asked slowly. Claire gave the smallest nod. "I co-founded it." The room went silent in a completely different way now. Not the tense silence of failing negotiations. The hollow silence of realization arriving too late. Jonathan actually took one step back. "You co-founded," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence because every assumption he had made that morning was collapsing in rapid sequence. Administrative support. Temporary replacement. Quiet note taker. The labels now sounded ridiculous even inside his own head. "Then why are you in administrative support at Reed Capital?" he asked, and for the first time there was no command in his voice, only bewilderment. Claire folded her hands over the binder. "Because 3 months ago your Human Resources Department posted an internal consulting observation role under a general support classification. I applied because I was looking for lower pressure work after my husband's illness last year." Jonathan swallowed. She continued gently, "No one asked much beyond whether I could organize files and attend meetings." Jonathan remembered signing a stack of low-level personnel approvals without reading names. His stomach sank. Claire Bennett had entered his company through the side door because no one had looked closely enough to notice who she was. Including him. Especially him. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a humorless laugh. "So I told one of the most respected cross-cultural advisors in this industry to sit down and take notes." Claire met his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Reed. You did." And there it was, not spoken cruelly, not sharpened for revenge, just placed between them with calm honesty. Sometimes the cleanest truths leave the deepest marks. Jonathan Reed stood motionless for several seconds, the skyline of Manhattan glowing behind him like a backdrop to a lesson he had not wanted but could no longer avoid. Claire Bennett did not look angry. She did not look vindicated. She simply looked tired in the quiet way people do when they have spent years letting others underestimate them because correcting every assumption becomes exhausting. Jonathan had no defense ready for that kind of dignity. Men like him survived on quick explanations, on hierarchy, on confidence sharpened into authority. But none of those tools worked when the evidence of his misjudgment was standing 3 feet away holding a plain binder. He cleared his throat. "Why did you not say something sooner?" Claire considered the question, then answered with disarming simplicity. "You did not ask." Jonathan lowered his eyes. The sentence struck harder than accusation because it exposed the exact place where his failure began. He had looked, but he had not seen. He had spoken, but he had not listened. He had assumed, an assumption had nearly cost him $200 million and the respect of men whose partnership he desperately needed. Outside the suite, muted laughter drifted in from the private lunchroom where his team was now celebrating a deal they did not fully understand had been saved by someone they had barely acknowledged. Jonathan leaned one hand against the conference table. "Claire," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I owe you an apology." She said nothing, allowing the silence to do what silence often does, force honesty from people accustomed to avoiding it. Jonathan inhaled. "I judged you in the first 5 seconds you walked into this room. I decided what you were worth before hearing 10 words from you. And I was wrong." Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. "That happens more often than you might think." Jonathan gave a faint nod, ashamed by how believable that sounded. He reached for one of the unsigned internal personnel folders still lying on the table, then set it back down. Titles suddenly felt smaller than the moment required. "Reed Capital needs someone with your experience in a far more serious capacity," he said. "International strategy. Executive advisory. Whatever position you want, I can make it happen today." Claire looked out the window for a moment, sunlight catching the edge of her silver watch. "I appreciate that," she said quietly, "but that is not the most important thing you can offer." Jonathan frowned. "Then what is?" Claire turned back to him, her voice calm, almost gentle. "The next time someone walks into your room dressed plainly, sitting quietly, or carrying less status than everyone else, do not reduce them before they have had the chance to exist. Jonathan felt the truth settle over him with humiliating permanence. This was larger than a job offer. Larger than a saved contract. Larger even than the embarrassment of being outperformed. It was a mirror held to a habit he had built into leadership and mistaken for efficiency. Claire gathered her binder under one arm. "People tell you who they are," she said, heading toward the door, "but only if your ego is not speaking too loudly to hear them." She left with the same soft footsteps she had entered with that morning. No dramatic exit. No lingering glance. Just quiet departure. Jonathan remained alone in the gleaming conference suite, surrounded by leather chairs, signed contracts, and all the polished symbols of power that had failed to make him wise. On the table sat the preliminary agreement worth $200 million, saved by the one person he had treated as invisible. He looked at the empty chair by the wall where Claire had spent the first hour taking notes in silence, and for the first time in many years, Jonathan Reed understood something every billionaire eventually learns if life is patient enough to teach it. Wealth can buy the room. Authority can command the room. But only humility allows you to recognize the most valuable person already inside it.